On the morning of June 7, 1944, Technical Sergeant Forrest Guth crouched behind a hedgerow in Normandy, listening to absolutely nothing. The air smelled of wet grass, cow manure, and the faint chemical sweetness of explosives that had detonated hours earlier, but the overwhelming sensation was silence, a silence so complete that Guth could hear his own heartbeat and the breathing of the man pressed against the dirt beside him. He was 23 years old, a former draftsman from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who had enlisted after Pearl Harbor with the vague expectation that war would be many things, none of them this. He had jumped into France the previous night, landed in the wrong field, spent hours finding his unit, and now waited behind a wall of earth and vegetation for something to happen. Nothing happened. Nothing continued to happen for intervals that stretched and compressed in ways that made time itself unreliable. The movies that Guth had watched before the war, the newsreels, the training films, the Hollywood productions that depicted combat as a continuous surge of action, had prepared him for an experience that did not exist. What existed was waiting. Waiting in foxholes, waiting behind hedgerows, waiting in ruined buildings, waiting for orders that might come in minutes or hours, waiting for Germans who might attack or might not, waiting for the war to arrive at his particular position and transform boredom into terror without warning. The transformation, when it came, lasted seconds or minutes before subsiding back into the waiting that constituted the overwhelming majority of his combat experience. He would later estimate that 90% of his time in the war was spent doing nothing that would register as action in any film ever made. E Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, the unit that would later achieve fame as the Band of Brothers, had scattered across the Norman countryside during the night drop that preceded the beach landings. Guth had trained with these men for 2 years, had jumped from aircraft and exercises across England, had developed the physical conditioning and tactical skills that the Army considered necessary for airborne operations. None of that training had prepared him for the experience of sitting in a hedgerow, not knowing where the enemy was, not knowing where his own battalion was, not knowing whether the invasion was succeeding or failing, not knowing anything except that the field in front of him was empty and the field behind him was also empty, and somewhere probably Germans existed who might or might not attempt to cross those fields at some point that could not be predicted. The hedgerows themselves were nothing like what briefings had described. They were not decorative boundaries between agricultural plots. They were fortress walls, earthen embankments 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense vegetation whose roots had grown for centuries into barriers that no vehicle could penetrate and no soldier could see through. Each field was a separate defensive position. Each hedge line was a potential ambush site. The terrain that maps had depicted as open farmland was actually a maze of compartments that channeled movement, obscured observation, and transformed what should have been mobile warfare into a grinding series of isolated engagements whose outcomes depended on factors that no amount of training could control. Guth's war, in those first days, consisted of movement from hedgerow to hedgerow, interspersed with episodes of violence so brief and disorienting that they defied the narrative structure that films imposed on combat. A burst of machine gun fire, shouted commands, movement toward or away from the firing, bodies that had been men moments earlier, then silence again and waiting, and the particular exhaustion that came not from physical exertion but from the sustained tension of anticipating death that might arrive at any moment or might not arrive at all. The terror, when it arrived, came without the dramatic buildup that cinema required. Guth was moving through a gap in a hedgerow when the machine gun opened fire from a position no one had identified. The sound was not the rhythmic chatter of movie gunfire, but a continuous tearing noise, like heavy canvas being ripped by a giant, and the air around him became suddenly alive with things he could not see but could feel, disturbances in the atmosphere, snaps and cracks that his training told him were bullets passing close enough to kill. He was on the ground before he consciously decided to drop, his body responding to stimuli faster than his mind could process them. his face pressed into Norman soil that tasted of grass and chalk and something metallic that might have been blood or might have been his own fear given physical form. The engagement lasted perhaps 90 seconds. Men fired back at muzzle flashes they could barely see through the vegetation. Someone threw a grenade that detonated with a sound smaller than movies suggested, a sharp crack rather than the thunderous explosion that Hollywood sound designers preferred. The machine gun stopped firing. Voices shouted in German, then stopped. Silence returned, broken only by the breathing of men who had not been breathing moments earlier and the moaning of someone who had been hit. Guth lay in the dirt, waiting for the next burst that did not come, his heart pounding so violently that he could feel it in his throat and his fingertips and his eyes. When the order came to move forward, he moved forward. The hedgerow beyond contained 2 German soldiers who were no longer alive. He did not look at them closely. Looking closely was something movies encouraged and reality punished. The discontinuity between these moments of violence and the hours that surrounded them created a psychological texture that no film could capture. Guth would spend an afternoon sitting in a farmhouse cellar listening to artillery shells pass overhead, with sounds that varied according to their trajectory. The ones that would miss made a different noise than the ones that might not. And then spend an evening eating cold rations in a field where nothing happened and nothing threatened to happen, and the war seemed to exist somewhere else entirely. The transitions were instantaneous and unpredictable. A quiet road became a killing ground without warning. A contested position became suddenly safe when the Germans withdrew for reasons that were never explained to the men they had been shooting at moments earlier. The narrative coherence that audiences expected from war films did not exist in the experience of men who fought wars. The physical reality of combat equipment contradicted Hollywood's portrayal in ways that affected every moment of Guth's existence. His pack weighed over 80 pounds with ammunition, rations, and gear that planners had determined he would need. The weight transformed movement into labor, made running nearly impossible, turned every hedgerow crossing into an exercise in exhaustion management. His rifle, the M1 Garand that films depicted as a precise instrument of American superiority, functioned reliably most of the time, but required constant attention to keep functioning. Dirt, moisture, the residue of fired rounds, the simple wear of continuous use, all of these degraded performance in ways that training had mentioned but not emphasized. The weapon jammed at moments when jamming could be fatal. The grenades he carried were heavier than they looked in movies. The helmet that protected his head also limited his peripheral vision and hearing, creating vulnerabilities that the protection was supposed to offset. Guth learned quickly that survival depended less on the skills that training had emphasized than on factors that no training could address. Luck determined who stood in the path of bullets and who stood inches away. Luck determined which shells fell short and which fell long. Luck determined whether the German machine gunner was experienced or frightened, alert or exhausted, aiming carefully or firing blindly. The films showed heroes whose skill and courage determined their fates. The reality showed men whose fates were determined by variables beyond their perception or control, who lived or died according to probabilities that no individual action could significantly alter. Guth was not a hero in the way movies defined heroism. He was a man trying not to die in circumstances that made not dying largely a matter of chance. The first misconception that every war film perpetuated was the idea that combat was something that happened continuously, that soldiers experienced war as an unbroken sequence of dramatic events. The reality Guth lived was different in kind, not merely in degree, a reality of waiting and terror in proportions that films could not depict because the waiting was boring and the terror was too brief and too random to support narrative structure. 6 months before Guth landed in Normandy, on the opposite side of the world, Lieutenant Commander John Thach had already learned the second lesson that Hollywood refused to teach. American equipment was not superior. It was often inferior, sometimes drastically so, and the men who used it survived not because of technological advantage, but despite technological disadvantage. Thach was 37 years old in June 1942, a former farm boy from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, who had learned to fly in the Navy's training program and risen through the ranks to command Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the USS Yorktown. His face was weathered by years of sun and salt wind, his hands calloused from control sticks and throttle levers, his reputation built on a career of peacetime excellence that combat was about to test in ways no peacetime exercise could simulate. The aircraft Thach flew into the Battle of Midway was the Grumman F4F Wildcat, and every pilot who flew it understood its limitations with a clarity that post-war films would systematically obscure. The Wildcat was slower than the Japanese Zero, approximately 30 miles per hour slower in level flight and dramatically slower in climb. It was less maneuverable. The Zero could turn inside a Wildcat with an ease that made dogfighting suicidal for American pilots who attempted to match Japanese tactics. It had a lower service ceiling, a shorter range, and an inferior rate of roll that made defensive maneuvering difficult against an opponent whose aircraft seemed to pivot in the air. The Wildcat's only advantages were its rugged construction, which allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy a Zero, and its armament of 6.50 caliber machine guns, which could inflict catastrophic damage if hits were achieved. Achieving hits against an aircraft that could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew was the problem that Thach had spent months trying to solve. The solution he developed, the defensive tactic that would carry his name into aviation history, emerged not from confidence in American superiority, but from desperate recognition of American inferiority. The Thach Weave was a formation maneuver in which two aircraft flew parallel courses and turned toward each other when attacked, each pilot protecting the other's tail by firing at enemies pursuing his wingman. The tactic worked because it transformed the Wildcat's disadvantages into something like equilibrium. A Zero chasing one Wildcat would find itself flying into the guns of another Wildcat turning to meet it. The maneuver required precise coordination and absolute trust between pilots, but it allowed Wildcats to survive engagements with aircraft that should have destroyed them. Thach had invented the tactic by studying Japanese capabilities and acknowledging that his aircraft could not match them in any conventional engagement. The films that depicted American air combat showed sleek fighters piloted by confident aviators who dominated the skies through skill and superior machines. The reality Thach experienced at Midway was different. His Wildcats were outclassed by every measure that mattered in aerial combat. His pilots were facing opponents whose training was longer, whose experience was deeper, whose aircraft were better suited to the conditions of Pacific warfare. The Japanese pilots he encountered had spent years perfecting their skills in China, accumulating combat hours that American pilots could not match. The institutional arrogance that would later characterize American aviation, the assumption that American technology and American training produced inherently superior results, did not exist in June 1942. What existed was the knowledge that survival required tactics designed to compensate for inferiority, not tactics that assumed superiority. Guth's experience in Normandy reflected the same reality through different equipment. The Thompson submachine guns that films showed American soldiers wielding with casual proficiency were heavy, prone to jamming, and inaccurate beyond close range. The bazookas that were supposed to destroy German tanks frequently failed to penetrate armor that had been upgraded since the weapon's design. The radios that should have enabled coordination between units malfunctioned constantly, their vacuum tubes fragile, their frequencies crowded, their operators struggling to communicate through static and interference that made battlefield coordination more aspiration than reality. The Germans, whom Hollywood would later portray as technologically outmatched by American industrial might, fielded weapons that American soldiers learned to respect and fear. The MG-42 machine gun, whose rate of fire exceeded anything in the American arsenal. The Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, whose simplicity and effectiveness influenced post-war American designs. The 88mm gun that destroyed tanks and aircraft with equal facility. The myth of American technological supremacy served post-war purposes that had nothing to do with historical accuracy. It confirmed beliefs about national character that Americans wanted to hold. It simplified narratives that were actually complex. It made victory seem inevitable rather than contingent, earned rather than lucky, deserved rather than achieved through sacrifice and adaptation that superior equipment would have made unnecessary. The equipment failures that Guth witnessed in Normandy accumulated into a catalog of inadequacy that contradicted everything Hollywood would later suggest about American materiel superiority. His unit's experience with the M1 carbine illustrated the pattern. The weapon had been designed for officers and support personnel who needed something lighter than the M1 Garand, but combat conditions revealed deficiencies that testing had not anticipated. The carbine's .30 caliber round lacked the stopping power of the Garand's ammunition, failing to incapacitate enemy soldiers at ranges where the Garand remained lethal. The magazine release was positioned where a soldier's grip could accidentally activate it, dumping ammunition onto the ground at moments when ammunition was the difference between survival and death. The operating mechanism was sensitive to dirt and cold, jamming with frequencies that peacetime testing had not predicted because peacetime testing did not replicate the conditions of actual combat. Thach had encountered equivalent failures in naval aviation equipment. The torpedo bombers that flew from American carriers at Midway, the Douglas TBD Devastator, were so slow, so poorly armed, and so vulnerable that the Japanese shot them down with something approaching leisure. Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from the Hornet, lost all 15 aircraft and 29 of 30 crew members without scoring a single hit on Japanese ships. The men who died in those aircraft had been sent into combat with equipment that their commanders knew was inadequate, equipment that represented not American industrial excellence, but American industrial failure to anticipate what combat would require. The Devastator had entered service in 1937 and should have been replaced years before Midway. It had not been replaced because replacement required resources that peacetime budgets did not provide and institutional inertia that peacetime urgency did not overcome. The German equipment that Guth's unit faced in Normandy reflected a different approach to military technology, an approach that prioritized capability over quantity in ways that American planners had consciously rejected. The German MG-42 machine gun fired 1,200 rounds per minute, so fast that individual shots blurred into a continuous sound that American soldiers called Hitler's bawsaw. The American equivalent, the M1919 Browning, fired 500 rounds per minute, less than half the German rate. The differential meant that German defensive positions could deliver suppressive fire that American positions could not match, that German machine gunners could pin down advancing Americans with a volume of fire that overwhelmed the responses American weapons could generate. Guth learned to identify the MG-42 by sound alone, the tearing fabric noise that signified danger more immediate than other weapons produced. The German Panzerfaust that Guth's unit encountered in the hedgerows was a disposable anti-tank weapon so simple that a soldier could learn to fire it in minutes. It cost approximately $10 to manufacture. It could destroy a Sherman tank that cost $50,000. The economics of this exchange rate favored the defense so dramatically that American armored units learned to approach hedgerows with a caution that films never depicted. A teenager with a Panzerfaust hidden in vegetation could eliminate a tank and its crew with a single shot from a weapon that required no specialized training and no logistical support beyond the delivery of more Panzerfausts to replace the ones that had been fired. The American bazooka, which was supposed to provide equivalent capability, frequently failed to penetrate the upgraded armor that German tanks carried by 1944, leaving infantry without effective anti-tank weapons at ranges where the Panzerfaust remained lethal. Thach understood the broader pattern that these individual failures represented. American industrial capacity was genuinely overwhelming. The production numbers that would eventually bury Axis forces under mountains of materiel were not fabrications. But industrial capacity and equipment quality were different things. The quantity of American production compensated for qualitative deficiencies that the production itself could not address. The Sherman tanks that American factories produced in tens of thousands were individually inferior to the German Panthers and Tigers they faced. The strategy was to accept this inferiority and overwhelm it with numbers, to lose 3 Shermans for every Panther destroyed and still have Shermans remaining when the Panthers were gone. The strategy worked, but it worked through sacrifice that superior equipment would have made unnecessary. The films that emerged after the war reversed this reality entirely. They showed American soldiers wielding weapons that functioned flawlessly, flying aircraft that dominated the skies, driving tanks that crushed opposition through superior design rather than superior numbers. The reversal served psychological purposes for audiences who wanted to believe that their fathers and grandfathers had fought with the best equipment that the world's greatest industrial power could provide. The truth that American soldiers had often fought with equipment that was adequate at best and inferior at worst, that victory required adaptation and sacrifice that better equipment would have prevented, was less comforting and therefore less often told. The third misconception that Hollywood perpetuated shaped audience expectations so thoroughly that its falseness remained invisible even to viewers who considered themselves sophisticated consumers of war films. Movies showed soldiers who understood the strategic context of their actions, men who discussed grand strategy in foxholes, who grasped how their particular battle fit into the larger campaign, who possessed situational awareness that extended beyond their immediate circumstances to encompass the war's overall trajectory. Guth's experience inverted this completely. He knew almost nothing about what was happening beyond the hedgerow in front of him, and what little he knew was usually wrong. The information blackout that defined enlisted experience in World War II was so total that it constituted a different kind of warfare than films depicted. Guth did not know whether the D-Day landings had succeeded or failed until days after the fact. He did not know whether the units on his flanks were advancing or retreating, whether the Germans were reinforcing or withdrawing, whether the objectives his company pursued were critical or peripheral to operations he could not see. His war consisted of orders that arrived without explanation, movements whose purposes were not disclosed, engagements whose outcomes he could not assess because assessment required information that no one provided. The strategic clarity that films granted their characters, the sense that individual actions connected to comprehensible larger purposes, was a fabrication that bore no relationship to what soldiers actually experienced. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy illustrated this informational poverty with particular clarity. Guth's company would receive orders to take a specific field, bounded by specific hedgerows, defended by Germans whose strength and disposition were unknown. The company would take the field or fail to take it, would suffer casualties whose relationship to strategic objectives could not be calculated, would consolidate and wait for further orders that might come in hours or might not come at all. Whether the field mattered, whether its capture advanced the campaign or merely occupied men who might have been better employed elsewhere, was information that Guth did not possess and could not obtain. He fought in a fog that was not meteorological but informational, a blindness that extended from the privates in the rifle squads to the sergeants who led them, to the lieutenants who commanded companies whose place in the larger battle remained opaque to everyone below the level of regimental headquarters. Thach experienced a different version of the same blindness in naval aviation. His pilots flew missions whose purposes were explained in briefings that provided tactical objectives without strategic context. They attacked targets because they were ordered to attack targets, defended carriers because they were ordered to defend carriers, and understood the relationship between their actions and the war's outcome only through inference and rumor that proved unreliable more often than not. At Midway, Thach knew that his squadron was engaging Japanese aircraft. He did not know, while the engagement was occurring, that the battle represented a turning point that would alter the Pacific War's trajectory. That knowledge came later, constructed by historians from records that participants did not possess. In the moment, Thach experienced chaos, violence, and survival, not the coherent narrative that retrospective accounts would impose. The absence of information created psychological conditions that films could not depict because the absence itself was undramatic. Guth spent hours not knowing whether he was winning or losing, whether his friends in adjacent units were alive or dead, whether the sounds of distant combat signified success or disaster. The uncertainty was not tension in the dramatic sense, not the anticipation of revelation that storytelling employed to maintain audience engagement. It was simply not knowing, a cognitive state without narrative shape, a blankness that extended indefinitely and resolved not into clarity but into different forms of not knowing. Films required characters who understood their circumstances well enough to make meaningful choices. Guth's circumstances were opaque, his choices constrained by orders whose rationale was not shared with him. The men who fought alongside Guth constructed understanding from fragments that rarely assembled into coherent pictures. Rumors circulated about breakthroughs and disasters that might or might not have occurred. Observations were extrapolated into conclusions that subsequent events might confirm or contradict. The soldier's knowledge of the war was local, immediate, and unreliable, limited to what he could see, hear, and survive, extended only slightly by information that passed through channels distorted by repetition and wishful thinking. The strategic awareness that films depicted was a privilege reserved for generals whose headquarters contained maps and radios, and staff officers whose job was synthesizing information that never reached the men doing the fighting. Guth's experience of the war's end illustrated the information blackout's persistence. He did not learn of Germany's surrender through official channels, but through rumors that proved true only when orders arrived confirming what rumor had suggested. The war ended not with dramatic revelation, but with gradual recognition that the shooting had stopped, that movements no longer encountered resistance, that the enemy who had been trying to kill him yesterday was no longer trying to kill him today. The narrative climax that films required, the moment of transformation when war became peace, did not exist in Guth's experience. What existed was uncertainty that slowly resolved into different uncertainty, not knowing that became differently not knowing. The fourth misconception that Hollywood embedded in public understanding concerned the fundamental nature of combat itself. Films depicted warfare as a series of personal encounters, soldiers aiming at visible enemies, firing with intent to kill specific individuals, experiencing combat as a contest between identifiable human beings whose fates were determined by skill, courage, and the dramatic requirements of narrative. Guth's actual experience of combat bore almost no resemblance to this portrayal. He rarely saw the men he shot at. He fired at muzzle flashes, at hedgerows that concealed positions, at windows in buildings that might or might not contain enemies. The industrial nature of modern warfare had transformed killing from a personal act into a mechanical process in which the relationship between shooter and target was abstract, statistical, and profoundly impersonal. The suppressive fire that dominated infantry combat was designed not to kill but to prevent movement. Guth fired thousands of rounds during his time in combat, the vast majority aimed at locations rather than individuals, intended to keep German heads down rather than to put bullets through German bodies. The mathematics of this firing were understood by military planners who calculated ammunition expenditure per enemy casualty and arrived at figures that would have seemed absurd to audiences conditioned by films to expect that bullets found targets with dramatic regularity. Estimates varied, but studies conducted during and after the war suggested that small arms fire killed one enemy soldier for every 15,000 to 50,000 rounds expended. The disparity between ammunition consumed and casualties produced reflected not poor marksmanship, but the nature of combat itself, a nature that films could not depict because suppressive fire directed at empty space lacked the visual drama that audiences expected. Thach had observed the same phenomenon in aerial combat, though the specific dynamics differed. The dogfights that films portrayed as balletic duels between visible opponents were actually engagements characterized by speed, confusion, and the fundamental difficulty of hitting a target moving in 3 dimensions at velocities that exceeded human perceptual capacity. Thach's pilots fired at aircraft they glimpsed for fractions of seconds, leading targets by distances they estimated rather than calculated, squeezing triggers in moments when instinct suggested alignment that instruments could not confirm. The hit rates that aerial gunnery achieved were far lower than films suggested. Most rounds fired in air combat missed, and many pilots completed entire tours without confirmed kills despite participating in numerous engagements. The aces whose scores dominated aviation mythology were statistical outliers whose success reflected exceptional circumstances as much as exceptional skill. The geometry of combat mattered more than the marksmanship that films emphasized. Thach's defensive weave worked because it created angles that forced attacking aircraft into predictable positions, not because the pilots who flew it were better shots than their opponents. Guth's survival in the hedgerows depended on positioning, on being in places where German fire could not reach, rather than on superior accuracy that allowed him to kill Germans before they killed him. The men who survived combat learned to think in terms of cover, concealment, fields of fire, and dead space, the tactical geometry that determined who could shoot whom, rather than the shooting skill that determined who could hit whom. Films reversed these priorities entirely, showing heroes whose marksmanship overcame positional disadvantages that real combat made insurmountable. The machine gun had transformed infantry warfare into a mathematics of angles and exposure times that reduced individual skill to marginal significance. A soldier crossing open ground faced probabilities calculated by the number of weapons covering that ground, the rate of fire those weapons could sustain, and the time required to complete the crossing. His personal qualities, his courage, his training, his determination, affected these probabilities only at the margins. The machine gun did not care whether he was brave or cowardly, skilled or untrained, motivated or reluctant. It swept the ground with fire that killed according to statistical distributions rather than moral assessments. Guth understood this with a visceral clarity that no film could convey. The men who died beside him had not been less skilled or less brave than the men who survived. They had been unlucky, present in spaces that bullets occupied, absent from spaces that remained safe for reasons no one could predict. The psychological consequences of this impersonal killing shaped veterans in ways that films systematically ignored. Guth had killed men without seeing their faces, without knowing their names, without experiencing the personal confrontation that dramatic convention considered essential to meaningful violence. The killing was real. Men had died because he and his fellow soldiers had fired weapons in their direction, but the reality was abstract, mediated by distance and vegetation, and the chaos that made individual causation impossible to establish. He did not know how many men he had killed. He could not know. The information did not exist in any form that could be retrieved or calculated. Films showed soldiers who knew what they had done, who carried specific deaths as specific burdens. Guth's carried uncertainty, the knowledge that he had participated in killing without the knowledge of what his participation had specifically caused. The fifth misconception that films perpetuated concerned the meaning of heroism itself, the belief that soldiers who performed extraordinary actions experienced those actions as extraordinary, that heroes knew they were heroes, that courage felt like courage in the moment it was exercised. Guth's experience contradicted this entirely. The actions that military citations would later describe as heroic had not felt heroic when he performed them. They had felt like the only options available in circumstances that offered no alternatives. The narrative framework that transformed survival into valor, that converted necessity into nobility, was imposed afterward by institutions that required heroes for purposes that had nothing to do with what the men being honored had actually experienced. The randomness of survival created psychological burdens that Hollywood systematically avoided depicting. Guth had watched men die who were braver than he was, more skilled than he was, more deserving of survival by any measure he could imagine. He had survived engagements that should have killed him through luck so arbitrary that it defied any interpretation suggesting merit or meaning. The bullet that killed the man beside him could have killed him instead, would have killed him instead if either of them had been positioned inches differently. The artillery shell that landed 10 meters to his left rather than directly on his position had not spared him because he deserved sparing. It had spared him because artillery shells fell where physics directed them, not where justice required. The survivor's guilt that would haunt veterans for decades after the war emerged from this recognition, the knowledge that living implied nothing about the men who lived, and dying implied nothing about the men who died. Thach had processed similar recognitions through the particular lens of aerial combat. His pilots had died in aircraft that exploded, burned, or spiraled into the Pacific, carrying men whose skill had been inadequate to circumstances that skill could not have overcome. The pilots who returned had not been categorically different from the pilots who did not return. They had been fortunate in ways that fortune's randomness made impossible to interpret as earned or deserved. Thach wrote letters to families that described sons and husbands as heroes because the conventions of such letters required heroic language, because families needed meaning that combat had not provided, because institutional purposes demanded that death be framed as sacrifice rather than waste. The letters were not lies. The men they described had genuinely performed their duties with courage and determination, but the letters imposed narrative coherence on experiences that had possessed no such coherence, transformed chaos into purpose, converted randomness into significance. The absence of dramatic meaning in actual combat represented perhaps the most profound divergence between Hollywood's war and the war that veterans remembered. Films required that events signify, that deaths advance plots, that sacrifices enable triumphs, that individual actions connect to outcomes that justify their costs. Guth's war offered no such signification. Men died for hedgerows that were abandoned the following week. Battles were fought for objectives that strategic revision rendered irrelevant before the fighting ended. The connection between sacrifice and outcome that dramatic convention required did not exist in the experience of men whose sacrifices contributed to outcomes they could not perceive, in ways that could not be traced, through mechanisms that resisted the narrative interpretation that audiences expected. The post-war processing of combat experience involved constructing meanings that combat itself had withheld. Guth and the men who had served with him developed narratives that connected their experiences to the war's larger purposes, narratives that were not false, but that had not existed in the moments being narrated. They had fought in the hedgerows and the forests and the frozen fields of the Bulge without the retrospective framework that would later make their fighting comprehensible. The meaning came afterward, assembled from outcomes that could not have been foreseen, interpreted through frameworks that the war's end made available. Veterans remembered their experiences through these constructed meanings, and the constructions became inseparable from the memories themselves, until what had been chaos became story, and what had been randomness became purpose. Thach's post-war career illustrated how institutional needs shaped the interpretation of combat experience. He became an admiral, developed tactical doctrines that influenced naval aviation for decades, and was celebrated as a hero whose innovations had contributed to victory in the Pacific. The celebration was not undeserved. His contributions were genuine, his courage documented, his skill acknowledged by contemporaries whose judgment merited respect. But the celebration also served purposes beyond historical accuracy, purposes that required heroes and resisted complexity, that needed clean narratives of American triumph and could not accommodate the uncertainty, the inadequacy, the luck that had actually characterized the experiences being celebrated. Thach participated in his own mythologization because participation was required, and because the myths served purposes that he considered legitimate, even when the myths diverged from memories that remained vivid decades after the events they commemorated. The question that neither Guth nor Thach could answer, that no veteran could answer, was whether the meaning constructed afterward was true or false, whether retrospective interpretation clarified or distorted, whether the narratives that made combat comprehensible honored or betrayed the experiences they organized. The films got it wrong, certainly. They showed heroes who knew they were heroes, combat that meant what it appeared to mean, warfare whose significance was available to participants rather than imposed by historians. But getting it wrong served functions that getting it right could not have served, and the functions mattered to audiences who needed wars to mean something more than the suffering they caused. Forrest Guth returned from the war in 1945 and did not speak about it for decades. He settled in Pennsylvania, married, raised children, and constructed a civilian life that bore no visible relationship to the hedgerows and frozen forests where he had spent the years that divided his youth from his adulthood. The silence was common among veterans of his generation, a reticence that emerged not from trauma alone, but from the recognition that what they had experienced could not be communicated to people who had not shared it. The films that appeared in the years after the war depicted a conflict that Guth did not recognize, populated by characters whose experiences bore no relationship to his own, structured by dramatic conventions that falsified everything they touched. He watched some of these films. He did not comment on their inaccuracies. Commenting would have required explanations that he could not provide to audiences whose understanding of war had been shaped by the very films he would have been correcting. Thach's post-war career carried him through the Navy's upper ranks to positions of increasing authority and diminishing connection to the cockpit where he had developed the tactics that bore his name. He became an admiral, commanded carriers and fleets, contributed to strategic planning that shaped American naval policy for decades. The Thach Weave remained in fighter doctrine long after the Wildcats that had first employed it were relegated to museums, its principles adapted to jet aircraft whose speeds would have seemed fantastical to the pilots who had flown propeller-driven fighters over Midway. Thach gave interviews, wrote articles, participated in the institutional memorialization that transformed his wartime experience into official history. The history was not false, his contributions were genuine, his recollections accurate within the limits of human memory, but the history served purposes that required simplification, that needed heroes more than complexity, that could not accommodate the fear and inadequacy and luck that had actually characterized the experiences being commemorated. The films continued appearing, each generation producing new versions of the war that repeated the misconceptions previous generations had established. Combat remained continuous rather than intermittent. Equipment remained superior rather than adequate. Soldiers remained strategically aware rather than profoundly ignorant. Killing remained personal rather than industrial. Heroism remained self-conscious rather than retrospectively constructed. The veterans who could have corrected these portrayals mostly did not, either because correction seemed futile or because the corrected version would have been too shapeless for audiences conditioned to expect narrative coherence. The misconceptions served functions that accuracy could not have served, providing meaning that combat had withheld, offering reassurance that sacrifice had purpose, constructing frameworks that made the war's costs bearable for societies that had paid them. Thach died on April 15, 1981, in Coronado, California, at the age of 76. His obituaries celebrated his tactical innovations, his leadership, his contributions to American victory in the Pacific. They did not mention the Wildcats' inferiority to the Zeros they had faced, the torpedo bombers that had been slaughtered at Midway, the equipment failures that had made American success contingent rather than inevitable. The obituaries told the story that institutions required, a story of American excellence vindicated by American triumph, of individual genius contributing to collective victory, of heroism that meant what heroism was supposed to mean. Thach had participated in constructing this story because construction was necessary, and because the alternative was a formlessness that served no one's purposes. Guth outlived Thach by 28 years, surviving into an era when the silence of his generation began to break. The interviews he gave in his final decades acknowledged what the silence had concealed, the terror that had not diminished with repetition, the randomness that had defied interpretation, the guilt that attended survival when survival seemed unearned. He spoke about friends who died in hedgerows whose locations he could still identify on maps, about engagements whose outcomes he still could not assess, about a war whose meaning remained uncertain despite the decades of memorialization that had attempted to fix it. The interviews were more honest than the films, but they were also shapeless in ways that films could not afford to be: fragmentary, contradictory, resistant to the narrative organization that audiences expected from stories about war. He died on November 10, 2009, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, at the age of 88. The obituaries identified him as one of the band of brothers, connecting him to the television series that had brought his unit's story to audiences who had not been born when the events depicted occurred. The series had repeated the misconceptions that all war films repeated: continuous combat, superior equipment, strategic awareness, personal killing, self-conscious heroism. But it had also brought attention to men whose service might otherwise have faded into the anonymity that most veteran service eventually reached. Guth had consulted on the production, had watched actors portray experiences that the actors could not have understood, had seen his war translated into entertainment that millions consumed without recognizing what the translation had cost in accuracy. The misconceptions persist because they serve purposes that accuracy cannot serve. Audiences need wars to mean something, need sacrifice to connect to outcome, need heroism to feel like heroism. The men who actually fought, who waited in hedgerows and flew inferior aircraft and killed without seeing and survived without deserving, understood that the need for meaning was itself a kind of meaning, that the stories told about them honored something even when the stories were wrong. Guth and Thach both participated in the mythologization of their own experiences, cooperating with filmmakers and historians and interviewers whose products they knew would falsify what they had lived. The cooperation was not betrayal. It was recognition that the truth they carried could not be transmitted intact, that what survived would necessarily be shaped by the needs of those who received it, that the war they remembered and the war that would be remembered were different wars whose relationship could not be reconciled. The films will continue getting it wrong. They will show combat as continuous, equipment as superior, soldiers as aware, killing as personal, heroism as self-conscious. They will get it wrong because getting it right would produce something that audiences would not watch, that institutions would not fund, that purposes would not be served by. The veterans who could have corrected the record are nearly gone now, their memories passing with them into a silence that no archive can fully preserve. What remains are the films, the constructed meanings, the misconceptions that have become the war that most people know. The distance between that war and the war that Guth and Thach actually fought grows wider with each year, and nothing can close it, and perhaps nothing should.